Imagine a creature so immense it darkens the landscape as it passes. An adult Argentinosaurus, weighing up to 100 tons and stretching over 100 feet long. Each footstep a minor tremor, each breath a gust of wind. In a world of giants, it was a titan, a living mountain of flesh and bone. Its very existence seems like a declaration of invincibility, an evolutionary final word on survival. Common sense dictates that no predator would dare challenge such a behemoth. To attack an animal of this magnitude would be suicidal, a fatal miscalculation. Yet the fossil record tells a different, more violent story. Paleontologists have unearthed sauropod bones scarred with the deep gouges of massive carnivorous teeth, evidence of a life-or-death struggle, proving that even the largest dinosaurs were not safe from determined hunters. This presents a fascinating paradox. If being the biggest animal on the planet wasn't a guarantee of safety, what else did these giants have in their defensive arsenal? How does an animal the size of a building escape predators that were themselves monsters, armed with teeth like railroad spikes? The answer lies not in one single trick, but in a complex suite of adaptations born from a 100-million-year arms race. The landscape of the late Cretaceous was a brutal stage for this drama. Packs of cunning carnivores like Mapusaurus or the colossal Giganotosaurus roamed these lands. They were specialists, evolved specifically to hunt. These enormous herbivores. For them, a lone or weakened sauropod wasn't an impossible target. It was the ultimate prize. The battle was not one of might, but of strategy and endurance. Understanding how these titans defended themselves requires us to look past their most obvious feature, their incredible size. While it was undeniably their first and most formidable line of defense, it was also a biological trap. Being that large came with its own set of critical vulnerabilities, weaknesses that determined predators were perfectly equipped to exploit, forcing the sauropods to rely on much more than just being big. The primary defense was, of course, that monumental size. This wasn't just about intimidation, it was a physical law. An adult sauropod was a fortress of flesh, with a thick, leathery hide that was incredibly difficult to pierce. Some later sauropods, like Saltosaurus, even evolved osteoderms, bony plates embedded in their skin, creating a form of natural chainmail that would frustrate the biting attacks of any predator. This sheer mass also created a stable internal body temperature, a phenomenon known as gigantothermy. This biological advantage meant they could sustain activity for longer periods than their cold-blooded attackers might have. A predator had to expend enormous energy to even attempt an attack, while the sauropod's bulk provided a deep well of stamina, turning any confrontation into a battle of attrition it was likely to win. Few predators would risk a frontal assault on a healthy adult. The danger of being crushed, kicked, or simply shoved aside by an animal weighing tens of thousands of pounds was too great. For a lone carnivore, a direct attack was out of the question. The risk of fatal injury was almost certain. This passive defense filtered out all but the most desperate or the most coordinated groups of hunters. However, this fortress had a fatal flaw. It took decades to build. A baby, Argentinosaurus, though large by our standards, was a bite-sized meal for the carnivores of its time. It lacked the mass, the armor, and the strength of its parents. The survival of the species, therefore, depended entirely on protecting these vulnerable young during their long, slow journey to adulthood, a challenge they couldn't face alone. This is where the individual's defense transformed into a collective one. A single sauropod was a fortress, but a group of them was a moving citadel. The key to their long-term survival wasn't just in their individual bodies, but in their social structure. They had to rely on each other, creating a living barricade to shield their future generations from the constant, circling threat of extinction. Fossil trackways provide compelling evidence that many sauropod species traveled in herds. These were not random gatherings, but structured social groups, and this structure was their most brilliant defensive tactic. Picture a herd moving across an ancient floodplain. The colossal adults form a perimeter, a walking wall of muscle and bone that is nearly impossible to breach. Inside this protective circle are the juveniles and the weaker members. This behavior, sometimes called the selfish herd theory, means that by grouping together, each individual reduces its personal chance of being attacked. For a predator, The challenge is no longer about taking down one animal, it's about finding a way through a dozen. Any attempt to penetrate the herd's outer defenses would be met with the combined might of multiple multi-ton animals, a truly terrifying prospect. The adults would have been highly protective, using their immense bodies to shield the young. A predator trying to dart in would face a forest of massive legs and a curtain of sweeping tails. The sensory input alone, the ground-shaking tremors, the low-frequency rumbles they used to communicate, would have been disorienting and intimidating for any carnivore trying to coordinate an attack on the herd's most precious and vulnerable assets. This social strategy was so effective that it forced predators to evolve in response. It's likely why we see the emergence of pack hunting behavior in giant carcharodontosaurids like Mapusaurus. Fossil sites show multiple individuals of these predators died together, suggesting they lived and hunted in groups. A single hunter couldn't crack the herd, so they teamed up, turning the hunt into a sophisticated, coordinated siege. But even the most organized herd could have a momentary lapse in its defense. A clever pack of predators could work to separate a younger or weaker individual from the safety of the group. In that moment, when the living barricade was broken, the sauropod would have to rely on more active and far more violent methods of self-preservation. It would have to turn its unique anatomy into a devastating arsenal. For years, the extraordinarily long necks and tails of sauropods were seen merely as tools for browsing high branches or for balance. But to survive in their world, every part of these dinosaurs had to serve a defensive purpose. The tail, in particular, was a formidable weapon. In species like Diplodocus and Apatosaurus, the tail ended in a long, thin section, a biological bullwhip of immense power. Computer models have shown that a rapid swing of these tails could generate incredible force. The tip could break the sound barrier, creating a deafening crack that would serve as a powerful deterrent. But this was no mere warning shot. A direct hit from such a tail could shatter the bones of an attacking predator, snap a leg, or even crush a skull, incapacitating a threat with a single, well-aimed blow. The neck, while more vulnerable, was not a passive liability. It was a massive, muscular lever. A sauropod could use its 20 or 30-foot-long neck to generate enormous momentum, shoving and bludgeoning any predator that got too close to its head or forequarters. While not a precision weapon like the tail, the sheer force of a neck shove from a 50-ton animal could knock a Giganotosaurus off its feet. These active defenses turned the sauropod from a passive target into a dangerous combatant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the world of dinosaurs, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss our future explorations. Which weapon do you think was more effective, the whip-like tail or the powerful neck? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Yet, swinging these massive appendages required space and carried the risk of overbalancing. They were powerful tools, but not always the most practical in close-quarters combat. For the predator that managed to slip past the tail and neck, the sauropod had one more brutally simple weapon, a weapon that relied on nothing more than gravity and the creature's own incredible weight. The legs of a sauropod were like ancient pillars designed to support an astronomical weight. Each foot was a massive, fleshy pad, in some species tipped with large claws. While their primary purpose was locomotion, these feet were also instruments of death. A predator that got too close, that found itself under the belly of a sauropod, was in the most dangerous place on Earth, because the giant's most direct weapon was right above it. Imagine a Mapusaurus darting in, snapping at a leg. The sauropod might not swing its tail or neck. Instead, it could rear back slightly on its hind legs, lifting a foreleg weighing several tons into the air, and then bring it crashing down with unimaginable force. There would be no defense. Such an impact would be instantly fatal, crushing bone and flesh into the dirt below. This form of defense is logical, but incredibly difficult to prove from the fossil record. It's a behavior, not an anatomical feature. Yet it's an inescapable conclusion of physics. Any animal of that size, when threatened at close range, would instinctively use its weight as a weapon. The stomp would have been a last resort, but perhaps the most definitive one available to these magnificent dinosaurs. However, this attack carried immense risk. Rearing up even slightly could compromise the sauropod's stability. If it stumbled or fell, its sheer body weight could cause catastrophic injuries. A broken leg would be a death sentence. The decision to use this weapon would have been a calculated gamble, a choice made only when the threat was immediate and lethal, and the potential reward of survival outweighed the risk. This implies a level of tactical thinking we don't often associate with these giants. The choice between a tail whip, a shove, or a stomp is not a simple reflex. It requires the animal to assess the situation, the predator's position, and its own stability. This challenges the outdated view of sauropods as dim-witted brutes and suggests a more complex intelligence at play, hidden within their massive frames. The old image of sauropods as slow-witted, swamp-bound creatures has been completely overturned by modern paleontology. While their brain-to-body mass ratio was low, their brains were far from primitive. The structure, inferred from CT scans of their fossilized skulls, shows well-developed sensory regions, suggesting they had good senses of smell and hearing, crucial for detecting predators long before an attack could begin. This cognitive ability was essential for managing their complex defensive strategies. It allowed them to maintain herd structures, communicate warnings, and coordinate a group defense. It enabled them to make critical decisions in the heat of battle, identifying the greatest threat in a pack of hunters, choosing the right defensive maneuver, and protecting the most vulnerable members of their group. They were not simply reacting, they were strategizing. Consider the life of a sauropod, which could span many decades. This long lifespan provided ample opportunity for learning. An older matriarch in a herd would have survived numerous predator encounters. Her experience, recognizing hunting patterns, knowing the best defensive formations, understanding when to stand and fight versus when to flee, would have been invaluable to the entire group's survival, passed down through social learning. This combination of physical power and cognitive ability made them incredibly resilient. They were not just passive mountains of flesh waiting to be eaten. They were intelligent, social animals with a deep understanding of their environment and the threats within it. They were active participants in their own survival, using every tool at their disposal, from their whip-like tails to their learned experiences, to stay alive. But even the smartest, strongest, and largest animal has a biological weakness. The predators that hunted them evolved a tactic that didn't rely on brute force to overpower the sauropod's defenses. Instead, it was a cruel and patient strategy that targeted the very essence of what kept these giants alive, their circulatory system. It was a war of attrition. The greatest predators of the sauropods, like Giganotosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, possessed a terrifyingly effective weapon, teeth that were not like spikes for piercing, but like serrated steak knives for slicing. Their skulls were built to withstand impact, but their bite was designed to open deep, catastrophic wounds. They were not trying to wrestle the giant to the ground in a single epic fight. Their strategy, particularly when hunting in packs, was one of relentless harassment. The predators would engage in a series of daring hit-and-run attacks. One would dart in, deliver a deep slicing bite to a flank or a leg, and then immediately retreat to safety before the sauropod could retaliate with its tail or a stomp. Then another member of the pack would do the same from a different angle. The goal was not an instant kill, but death by 1,000 cuts. Each deep gash would cause massive blood loss. A sauropod's circulatory system was a high-volume, high-pressure system needed to pump blood up its enormous neck. A significant wound would lead to exsanguination, the process of bleeding to death. It was a slow, agonizing, but brutally effective tactic that bypassed the sauropod's active defenses. The pack would then simply follow their wounded quarry. They didn't need to stay close and risk injury. They could trail the bleeding giant from a safe distance for hours or even days, waiting for it to grow weak. From shock and blood loss, once the sauropod was too exhausted to fight back, stumbling and near collapse, the predators would move in to finally end the hunt. This gruesome strategy reveals the true nature of the predator-prey relationship. It was a sophisticated, high-stakes chess match. The sauropod's defenses forced the predators to become smarter, more coordinated, and more patient. And in turn, the predators' tactics placed an immense evolutionary pressure on the sauropods to perfect their herd defenses and protective instincts, a brutal cycle that played out for millions of years. So how does the biggest dinosaur escape a predator? The answer is a complex symphony of defense. They used their passive size and armor as a first deterrent. They formed intelligent, moving citadels with their herds to protect the vulnerable. When forced into combat, they transformed their bodies into weapons, using powerful necks, bone-shattering tail whips, and earth-shaking stomps to fight for their lives. They were not passive victims in a world of monsters. They were active survivors in a brutal evolutionary arms race. As their predators grew larger, faster, and smarter, the sauropods grew ever more immense and developed more sophisticated social behaviors. This constant back and forth is what drove the evolution of some of the most spectacular creatures ever to walk the earth, a testament to life's relentless push for survival. The fact that sauropods thrived on every continent for more than 150 million years is the ultimate proof of their success. Their defensive strategies worked. They outlasted countless species of predators, adapting and evolving to meet every new threat that emerged. They were, by any measure, one of the most successful and enduring dynasties in the entire history of the amazing dinosaurs. When we look at the skeleton of an Argentinosaurus in a museum, we should not see a slow, stupid animal destined for extinction. We should see a survivor. We should imagine a highly complex social creature, a fortress of flesh with a brilliant defensive mind. The story of their struggle is written in their very bones, a magnificent and violent epic of life and death from a lost world.